Hello and good afternoon and welcome to this webinar brought to you by NQA. My name is Richard Walsh. I'm NQA's Principal Assessor, or one of NQA's Principal Assessors covering energy and environment. If you've attended one of these webinars before, you should by now know the drill. Any questions, please type them in the question box. Good afternoon, Chris, thank you. It is a beautiful spring day. It's sunny where I am as well. Hope it is where you all are. Thank you, Chris. Thanks for those good wishes. So the way the webinar works, any questions, as Chris has just done, type them in the question box on the side of the screen there, and we'll either try and address them as we go through, or we'll cover them towards the end. So what we thought we'd look at, it's a while since I've done this, as many of you probably know, I spend a lot of my time auditing environmental and energy standards, and we're starting to see perhaps what I might call mission drift. People are sort of losing what I would consider the core reasoning for having 14,001 in place, maybe starting to misunderstand some of the clauses. So I thought we'd go right back to basics, right back to where we started, how this standard started back in 2015, and let's just have a look at what the standard requires, what we as assessors might look for, and maybe in the hope that we can avoid any misconceptions and address any potential non-conformances. I always joke I'm contractually obliged to show a couple of slides about NQA right at the start, so that's who we are and where we're based. I'm not in London. I'm in the north of England, in a town called Halifax, and as I said earlier, it's nice and sunny outside on this lovely spring day. We cover an awful lot of standards. My particular areas are environment, energy, and tied in with that a bit of carbon neutrality as well. And as you can see there, worldwide and in the UK, we have a number of very large household names who we work with on a number of those standards. And although you can't see me today, that's me. That's my background. I've been at NQA now for the best part of 15 years, working in environment, and prior to that, I spent 12 years working for an environmental charity called Groundwork, who I noticed there's one or two people logged in who might remember and recognise Groundwork. I worked for Groundwork UK for a long number of years. Okay, so what we're going to do, well, we're going to have a think about what 14,000 is all about. Why is it here? What's it setting out to achieve? What are these overarching concepts? How's it structured? The main part of the presentation will be to have a look at the clauses, what's required, and what we assessors will look for in each of those clauses, and then maybe think about towards the end 14,001. Is it the end of the road? Is it a destination, or is it a stepping stone? One of the things I forgot to mention, there's no need to frantically write down everything I'm saying or try and write down everything you see on any of the slides. Everybody who's registered for the webinar will receive a PDF copy of the slides. And if you're familiar with YouTube and go to YouTube and search in the channels section, NQA have a channel, and this and all the other webinars we deliver, not just on environment and energy, but on health and safety and information security and quality and all sorts of things. They're all available on there for you to watch again and listen at your leisure. So no need to write it all down. And as I said, towards the end of this week, you will be sent a copy of the slides and I think a link to the recording. So we said it was back to basics. What's the standard all about? Excuse me. So this is more or less taken from the beginning of the standard itself, to provide organisations with a framework that will enable them to protect the environment and ultimately to be able to respond to changing environmental conditions. The standard requires that organisations, businesses, whatever they may be, implementing the standard, take this systematic approach. And it's a systematic approach to protecting the environment by preventing or mitigating adverse environmental impacts, mitigating the potential adverse effect of environmental conditions, and we've only got to turn on the TV, read the newspapers to see that the world is full of changing environmental conditions, mainly for the worse, but nevertheless, there are changing environmental conditions that we have to adapt to. A systematic approach to assisting the organisation in the fulfilment of its compliance obligations, things that it has to do either through legislation and regulation or things that it's promised to the community, to suppliers, to customers, things that the business have promised to do. Overall, enhancing the business's, the organisation's environmental performance and controlling and influencing the way that the products and services provided by that organisation are designed, manufactured, distributed, consumed, and ultimately disposed of. So the standard does require that we have a think about the life cycle of our products and of our services. So running through the standard, running through all of the different clauses, steering the direction that the standard wants us to go, are two real overarching concepts. One are the intended outcomes, which is the enhancement of our environmental performance, the fulfillment of compliance obligations, and ultimately the achievement of environmental objectives that we set ourselves. Woven into that is the management of change, focusing now on planning the newer standards. I still call them the new standards. They've been around since 2015, but the new standards as opposed to the previous versions. So the 2015 standards play, as we'll see shortly, place a greater emphasis on the planning process. They ask us to look at how we manage risk, not just our environmental aspects, but the whole risk around the environment, and these standards have been designed and written in such a way that they can be integrated with other standards and business processes. Those people who may have had me audit them, or maybe have sat in on some of my webinars previously, will know that there's a number of things that I like to stress, particularly around the use of words and phrases. And these are four that I think are very important and are taken from the standard itself. They're actually at the beginning of the annex, the second part of the standard, but nevertheless are contained within the pages of the standard. And we'll come back to these definitions in some of the clauses later on. The first two, some people think are interchangeable. However, the standard uses them in different ways. So where the standard says an organisation must consider something, the organisation has to think about that topic, has to think about what the implications, the ramifications of something are, but can choose to exclude those issues. If the standard says take into account, yes, again, it's necessary to think about the topic, but you then have to act on those thoughts. So whatever that might be that you have to take into account, you have to do something about it. And then the one that you will hear me talk about all of the time is the difference between the two words continual and continuous. The standard uses the words or the word continual, which is duration occurs over a period of time. The analogy I like to use to show the difference is a set of stairs and a ramp. So continual, which is what the standard asks us to use, is a set of stairs. So the direction is upwards, the direction is in the way of improvement. But just as you go up a set of stairs, occasionally you might pause and get your breath back, pause on a step and wait. Continuous, which you will not see in the standard, I see in many people's management systems, I see it in their policies, is a word that shouldn't be used because it means continuing improvement without interruption. So if a set of stairs is continual, a ramp is continuous. We're better today than we were yesterday. We're better this hour than we were last hour. And that's not really how it works. So those are a couple of things that I'd like you to just bear in mind as we go through looking at back to basics with 14,001. You might have seen this slide. I have various versions of this for the different standards I use. I have a version for 50,001 that I've used on some of the webinars if you've sat through some of those. But that basically shows what is known as the Annex SL. That's the, if you like, the blank version of a standard. All of the standards now follow that makeup, with the 10 clauses, of which 7, clauses 4 to 10, are the auditable clauses. And across the top, it then split that down into the sections of the Deming cycle: plan, do, check, act. And that's basically how 14,001 is set out. One of the things that, if you like, it came to my thought, this is a year or two ago now, the even clauses, the even number clauses, clauses 4, 6, 8, and 10, are when things actually happen. So clause 4, we think about who we are, the context in which we operate, the things that are important to us, what's the scope of our system, what sort of management system do we need. Clause 5 facilitates us moving on to clause 6. So in order to do something about what we've come up with, we need some leadership, we need to have a policy, and we need to define roles and responsibilities across the business. Once we've got that, to take what we did at clause 4, we then need to start to plan to do things. So we plan to address the risks and opportunities that we've identified. We set objectives and we start to plan for some of these changes. However, before we can do anything about it, we actually need some facilitation. We need some support. We need some resources. We need competent people. We need people to be aware of what we're doing. We need to communicate, and we need to have a way of managing documents. Having all of those allows us then to move on to clause 8, which again, an even numbered clause. That's where we put into practice the things that we were planning to do. Having put them into practice, we need to work out, are we achieving what we set out to do? We then need to facilitate some monitoring, some measurement, some thinking about what we're doing. Based on the results of that, we then set about some improvement and try and look at ways of improving our system, our management performance. So think of the even numbered clauses of clauses where things happen, and the odd numbered clauses about the facilitating clauses that take us from 4 to 6, 6 to 8, and 8 to 10. So no questions as yet. That's good. We'll keep going. Clause 4, context of the organisation. So this is all about identifying what it is that's important to us. What are those internal and external issues that we need to think about? Clause 4 also brings in some thoughts about the needs and expectations of interested parties, talks about the scope of our management system, and this is an interesting one, and one that I have come across a number of times. The scope shall not exclude activities, products and services that can have significant aspects. So we can't say we're actually going to do all of this within our business, but we're going to have a very narrow scope that only considers a small part of the business, providing that small part of the business would have to encompass everything that we do. We can't use the scope to exclude significant issues. And we do see this quite a lot, where people maybe just pick a scope of a small part of facilities management of a much larger organisation. And that's starting to create a false impression. And because of that, the standard now requires that the wording of the scope is available as documented information and available to interested parties. So what does it ask us to do? It asks us to think about the external and internal issues that are relevant to the organisation's purpose. What is it that we do? What is it that's relevant to us? But ultimately, what is it that's going to affect our ability to achieve the intended outcome? And the main intended outcome, don't forget, is the improvement of environmental performance. There's things out there that are going to help us, the things that are going to get in the way. What are they? We need to work them out. We need to document them and think about them. We need to think about where we sit, the context in which we operate, the needs of those around us, interested parties, stakeholders, customers, clients, suppliers, neighbours, employees, shareholders, investors, banks, insurers, you name it. They all have requirements, they all have things that they want of us. If we get all of this right, if we get this these foundations sorted out, it should result in our EMS focusing on the issues that present the greatest risk, and the standard use the term risk as a positive and a negative in achieving ultimately our environmental improvement. So think about it in this way when we're looking at context, because I see a lot of people that don't quite understand what they're trying to get out of context. So there are things that will help achieve the intended outcome of the EMS. So the things that are going to help us and the things that are going to get in the way. The things that will help we'll come back to in clause 611, and they'll become the opportunities, and we have to try and make sure that we maximize those opportunities, we grasp those opportunities, and we use them to their full advantage. The things that are going to get in the way, the barriers, the hurdles over which we have to jump, they then become the risks. Again, we can't ignore the risks. We then have to look at a way of minimizing the risk and making sure that whatever we do, we can address those risks and make sure that they have as little impact as possible. So these are the sorts of things that we would need to think about. There's no set way of doing this. This is the way that when I worked as a consultant, we used to encourage companies to think about environmental conditions, we think about external issues, and we think about internal issues. All of those will present opportunities, and a lot of those will also present some risks. And we have to think about, as we said, maximizing the opportunities, minimizing the risks. And the intent of all of this is within any organization to provide a high level understanding of those issues that can positively or negatively affect the way in which we manage our environmental responsibilities. So this is all about, this clause 4 is all about setting out firm foundations for the way that our system runs. So interested parties, second part of this clause, what is it that people want of us? What are those requirements? Which ones are we going to work with? Which ones are we going to comply with? If people want things from us, if we agree to that, they become compliance obligations. Now, as an absolute minimum, all relevant legal or regulatory requirements have to be included. We can't choose to ignore the law. It's not going to go away. But there will be other things, other promises, other commitments that we've made, which also then become compliance obligations. The older standards, the previous version of 14,001 used to call them legal and other requirements. They are now all compliance obligations. Sometimes we talk about mandatory obligations and voluntary obligations to try and show that same difference between legal and other requirements. But that's basically what we're talking about. Anything that anybody expects us to do, be it legislatively or something we promise to do. And as we said, the voluntary arrangements become obligations when we've agreed and adopted them. I alluded to this earlier, talked a little bit about it. We have to define the scope, have to define the physical and organizational boundaries of our EMS. We see an increasing number of businesses trying to use the scope to not to exclude certain things, but maybe to try and mitigate the impact of those on the EMS. We cannot allow any organisation to exclude significant aspects or evade compliance obligations by careful use of the scope. The scope has to include everything within the organisation. If you're going to exclude something, it shouldn't be something that would be considered significant, or something that would have its own peculiar compliance obligations. The scope mustn't be misleading. So you can't, for instance, claim to have ISO 14001, but when you actually look at it, it's only for, say, facilities management of the organisation. And we have a number of people that try and do that. And we're at great pains to make it clear that the scope is only facilities management. The scope isn't the whole of the organisation. Not something I would recommend, and something that you'll find your assessor try and pressures you into changing. The documented scope, as we've said, has to be available to interested parties. And then finally, at the very end of this first clause, establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve the management system to achieve those intended outcomes. Again, not only is the standard requiring that we continually improve our impact on the environment, our environmental performance, it also is a requirement, and it's a requirement within the policy, that we also make attempts to continually improve the effectiveness of the management system itself. And it's partly to help you with that I thought we would have a fresh look at the standard, go back to what it's actually requiring of us, and just look and see if there's anything that you can take from this presentation and use to actually tweak your system, make the system more relevant, make it more usable, make it more able to achieve those intended outcomes. Okay, so having gone through, if you remember, a doing clause, we're now on to a clause that talks about facilitating. What is it we need to actually start to do something? Well, we need some leadership and we need some commitment. And there's a whole range of standards that use this term leadership now. At one time, it used to talk about, the standards used to talk about senior management commitment, but all of the standards now talk about leadership, which to me is a much more proactive stance than just saying that we committed to something. So I've drawn out some of the main ones. There's a few more than this detailed in the standard, but these are the main ones, I think, when we see as assessors where we may have problems with leadership. The environmental management standard or system, or if you were applying this to health and safety or to quality or to energy, information security, they all say the same thing. The relevant part of the standard, the relevant part of the system, I'll come back to the question. Ginke, there's a question about best method and way of documenting the scope. We'll come back to that. I'll park that one. We'll answer that one at the end. So we need to make sure that the system itself isn't managed in isolation or separately from the core strategy of the business. So in other words, it's not, well, this is what we do as a business. Oh, and by the way, we do this environmentally. What we look for is, if you were to take a slice through any business, any organization, a little bit like a stick of rock at the seaside, if you took a slice through the business, you would see those strands of environment and sustainability running. We need to make sure that the EMS and environmental issues are considered when strategic business decisions are being made. One of the most frustrating things I find is that when I'm auditing and I speak to people who manage environmental systems or even energy management systems, by the time they get involved, the decisions have already been made. And the number of times I've heard people say, if only they'd involved me when the decision was made, if only they'd asked me earlier, we might have avoided some of this. We need to make sure that those people managing and running our businesses understand why it's important to involve environmental and indeed energy and sustainability considerations when these decisions are being made. We need to make sure that whatever it is we're thinking about environmentally is aligned with our business objectives, our wider business objectives. I've pulled a little bit from a clause further on. I always think this clause is in the wrong place. Clause 7.1 is actually about resources, and it's about the provision of resources, and I think that should be under leadership, because actually that's where the resources come from. So you will see time and time again on all of my webinars that we actually move resources and park it under leadership. We need to make sure that the system, the way a business manages environment, benefits from appropriate level of resources, receives appropriate involvement from across the business, provides real value to the organisation, and keep stressing this, continually improves, and hopefully the system remains successful in the long term. I'll quickly gloss over this. This is a reminder of the definition of top management: person or group of people who direct and control an organisation at the highest level. I'll let you read the rest of that. I'm not going to go into any great detail, but it is around the senior group of people on a site or within a business. But whoever they are, they have to take full accountability for the effectiveness of that environmental management system. Talked a little bit about the policy already. The policy has to be appropriate to what the business does. You can't just take somebody else's and cut and paste it. Has to be appropriate to the nature, the scale, and the environmental impact of the activities, products, and services of the organisation. It's a framework for setting environmental objectives. It's to be documented and made available to interested parties, communicated internally, and of course externally as well, because we've talked about being made available to interested parties. It has to make 4 basic commitments. You'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't, but you'd be surprised how many times I look at policies and they're missing one of these basic commitments. Read the standard. The standard tells you in no uncertain terms the policy must say this, 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 and this. And time after time, I see some of these missing. There has to be a commitment to protect the environment. There has to be a commitment that the organisation is going to fulfil its compliance obligations, be they legislation or be they what we would call voluntary commitments, voluntary obligations. The policy has to commit to the setting and achievement of environmental objectives and targets. And the one that gets missed most often, the policy has to commit to continually improving the management system in order to enhance the organisation's environmental performance. Go away, read your policy, well, not this minute, but go away at the end of this webinar, read your policies and make sure that they make all of those commitments. So, policy commitment, protection of the environment. Protection of the environment includes prevention of pollution and lots of other things as well. But prevention of pollution is one of the main commitments that we talk about. It can include sustainable resource use, climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, protection of biodiversity and ecosystems, along with restoration of the such if need be, water quality and air quality. The reason I put that little bit in at the bottom, 14,001 versus 50,001. And this isn't a webinar about 50,000, but one of my big disappointments is in the second part of 50,001 within the annex that states that the move towards on-site renewable energy sources, solar power, wind turbines, heat pumps, whatever it is that you're going to use, does not constitute an energy performance improvement. And I think that 14,001 achieves much more because it allows you to look at not only the amount of energy you're using, but also allows you to look at where the energy's come from. How clean is that energy? Look at the carbon impact of the energy that you're using. 50,001 isn't interested in where the energy's come from. It's about the amount of energy that's being used. In an ideal world, the two standards fit together. But I'll be honest now, we've had a number of clients who have decided that 50,001 doesn't give them the improvement that's needed to actually take into account a lower carbon energy source. So it's something to have a think about. I'm happy to talk to anybody about that. If you want to talk about that, I'll give you my contact details at the end and we can have a long chat about that. But it's something to think about how people use 14,001 and how 50,001 is used. Thinking about this facilitation clause, because it's an odd numbered clause, the final thing we need is to make sure that people are allocated individual roles and responsibilities within the business. Excuse me, the standard does not require, as we've said previously, a formal management representative. Most businesses I work with still do, but there is no formal requirement. It's deemed to be a shared responsibility, and there are these roles of ensuring that the system conforms to the requirements of the standard, and then reporting on performance, again, of the system, and also environmental performance back to the top manager. One of the biggest changes that was brought in with the 2015 standards, and indeed say the 2018 standards, the versions of ISO 45,001 for health and safety and for 50,001 for energy, is a much greater emphasis on planning. We don't just do something, we plan to do it in the first place, and then make sure that we have the required resources to put those plans into action. So what the standard asks us to think about here is to plan to address those issues that we talked about at the start. So remember the things that will help, things that will get in the way. They move on to clause 6.1, which is where we're going next. How can we start to think about improving, taking on the opportunities that we've identified, and how can we start to think about planning to do something about mitigating the risks? Again, it's all about planning to achieve the intended outcomes and preventing or reducing undesired effects and capturing the opportunities. All of this is aimed at achieving continual improvement in our environmental performance. So, 6.1.1, prioritise issues with potential adverse or beneficial effects. One of the reasons that this clause was brought in, that with the 2004 version of the standard, the minute you talked about risks and opportunities, everybody immediately turned to aspects. Oh, well, our aspects of this, our aspects of that, our impact on the environment is this, our impact on the environment is that. There's a lot of things, as I've already alluded to, out there that are not related to our aspects and impacts. So this clause, risks and opportunities, is separate to aspects and impacts. And it still happens. I go into organizations, I ask about what have you got to show me what you've done on risks and opportunities, and the first thing they show me is the aspect register. And there's a huge area of things that are being missed. There needs to be, as the little flowchart showed at the start, this linkage between context and clause 6.1.1, risks and opportunities. So we need to think about, yes, what are our aspects, and we'll come on to those in a minute. We need to think about, yes, what are our compliance obligations? But above all, we need to go back to clause 4.1 and 4.2 and think about those, the context in which we operate. Out of all of that, we then need to start to prioritize. Are they going to help us achieve our intended outcome? How can we prevent adverse effects? Are they going to help us achieve continual improvement? That's what this clause is all about. So, aspects. So an environmental aspect is something that has the ability to make a change, positive or negatively, to the environment, and the impact is what the actual change is. Now, the reason I've highlighted that is the standard says we have to take into account change, new or modified activities, products and services, and planned or new developments. Remember, take into account, we have to consider, and we have to act on it as well. So when I was talking about leadership and talking about maybe environmental managers saying by the time I found out it was too late, In a way, that's falling foul of this requirement. We have to take into account planned or new developments. So if these decisions are being made outside of the management system, then really we're in breach of the requirements of this particular clause. We have to think about abnormal and reasonably foreseeable emergency situations. We have to think about adverse and beneficial impact. Again, I see many businesses where the aspect register only looks at the negative things that are happening. And yet you go out into the yard and there's areas of biodiversity, there's areas of things that they're doing, there's maybe bird boxes, there's work being done to try and improve the area in which the business operates. They get missed. They're not in the aspect register. Why? We have to think about adverse and beneficial impacts. The results of this process have to be communicated internally. And we have to use a life cycle perspective. So what we're thinking about doesn't just stop at our factory gate, at the doors of our offices, at the edge of our car park, whatever it might be. We have to think about the life cycle of what it is that we're doing. So we have to look upstream about where we're buying things from, what resources are we buying in, how are those resources getting to us, and we also have to look downstream if it's a product, how's it being used, possibly how it's being disposed of. Now, one of the biggest questions, or one of the most popular questions I seem to get asked when this 2015 standard was written, was how far upstream and how far downstream do we have to go? And I always said the same thing: go back and read the standard and ask me the question again when you've read the standard. The standard says we only have to consider, take into account, I think it's take into account, we only have to take into account aspects and their associated impacts that we can control or influence. If you can't control it, so it's so far upstream that you've no control over it, it's so far downstream that you've no control or influence over it, then you don't have to consider it. The analogy I use, it's a little bit like standing at the roadside and crossing the road. You look left, you look to your right, you make a decision to cross the road. You can only make that decision on what you can actually see. You can't see round the bend, you can't see round the corner what traffic's coming. So therefore, in your own mind, when you're thinking about crossing your road, you wouldn't take that into account. You might think about the speed of the road, but generally you would think about basing your judgment on what you can see, and that's what we're saying here. We don't have to do, for the purposes of this standard, a full life cycle assessment. It's just about looking at the things that we can control or influence. Compliance obligations can still be called legal under the requirements. We have to determine and have access to them. What are they? What do they mean to us? Determine how they apply to us. Obviously, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of pieces of environmental legislation out there. It won't all apply to you as a business or as an organization. You have to determine if and how they apply to you. And if they do apply, you have to take them into account. You can't ignore them. You have to make sure that the management system reflects the requirements of that piece of legislation or that commitment that you've made to comply with something. And to go back to opportunities and risk, compliance obligation can result in a risk. It can also result in an opportunity because the standard sees risk as positive or negative. But it's this clause, this bit of the standard, this clause 613 is about looking at what's out there, looking at what information you've got. There's many different ways of doing it. You can do it yourself. You can subscribe to any number now of online processes that will help you achieve this. You can do it yourself. I work with a number of businesses that use external consultants to help them with this bit. But this bit of the clause is about making sure that you've got knowledge of the legislation, knowledge of the requirements, and you've factored in the requirements into your management system. We'll look later on about how we deal with, are we complying with it? This is about making sure that we know what they are and we have access to them and we have an understanding of what it is they require of us. However, one of the concepts within the standard is that we can manage risk and we can think about which risks we choose to manage and which risks we choose not to manage. Risk management cannot be applied into compliance obligations. So in other words, we can't accept as a valid risk the risk of non-compliance. We see this time after time after time. Maybe a good example would be in the water industry. Certainly within the UK, the water companies haven't had the best press recently because they seem to accept that it's a legitimate way to manage the business in allowing sewage outflow into the rivers. And they accept that risk of non-compliance because actually, in most cases, it's likely that the potential penalty is actually less than the cost of remediating it. Not every case, but it's an example of maybe how people accept a risk of non-compliance, and that's not permitted within 14,001. Finally, the last little bit of this section, planning action. Having done all of this, having thought about what these risks are, having thought about what our significant aspects are, having thought about what the legislation, the compliance obligations say of us, we have to start to think about what we're going to do. And 614 talks about how we're going to build into our management system, build into our wider business, the things that we need to manage. How are we going to think about evaluating the effectiveness? What options might we have in terms of technology? Have we got the financial input that we need? And what does the business require? And ultimately, we need to plan to decide how we're going to mitigate the things that we've just identified. Coming out of all of that, then we set objectives and targets. And we have to plan to achieve them. It's a policy commitment. You have to set objectives and targets. And generally, we accept that the objectives have to be consistent with the business's policy commitments. The number of times I see objectives that simply state to maintain certification to 14,001. We're looking for qualitative improvements in environment. This is where you set yourselves the targets of improving your environmental performance. What is it you're going to perform? Improve rather. How are you going to do it? What are these targets going to set? What does it look like? Now, we've made this statement. The chief executive signed the policy that says we're going to improve our environmental performance. In real terms, what does that actually mean? How can we measure it? Can we quantify it? Can we put figures on it? Can we report on that? This is all about setting these objectives. The term target, interestingly, has been removed from this standard. It's objectives and planning to achieve them. Those of you that might have ISO 50001 will see that the term target has been retained in there, mainly because 50,001 is much more playing a numbers game, whereas 14,001 is not necessarily about numbers. And sometimes it's about a qualitative rather than a quantitative improvement. Excuse me. So I've already said that we pinched clause 7.1 resources and put it under leadership, so we'll jump on. One of the big things that I see, some of the exams that I've set for some of the training that we do within NQA, particularly of our own auditors, I sometimes ask the question: does 14,001, does 50,001 require that our staff are trained? And you'd be surprised the number of people that say, yes, it does. The standards require that our staff are trained. No, it doesn't. The standard requires that staff are competent. Training is a part of competency, but not the whole part. The standards, all of the standards require that we employ and utilize competent staff, competent people. As a business, as an organisation, we decide what that competency should be. So we decide what is necessary for that individual to carry out the task that we're asking them to do that. And we need to ensure, no, I wouldn't say awareness is the better wording, because we're going to come on to awareness. I still think competency is the better word than training. Thank you for that point. And I'll maybe just dwell on that a little bit more in a slide or two's time when we come on to awareness. Thank you, Sean. So competency is what do we need people to be able to do, and how do we ensure that they are competent? Now, if it was about being competent to sit here and deliver this webinar, I'm not a graduate. I don't have a degree in environmental management. I have got now the best part of 28 years work in managing and operating environmental management systems, both implementation and, for the last 15 years, assessing. I'm a chartered environmentalist and I'm a full member of IEMA, but I don't have any environmental training certificates. It's done on competency, it's done on experience, it's done on the fact that I've been at this for such a long period of time. I've got a huge amount of experience, but I don't have any specific training. That's why I tend to use the word competency rather than training. That's why the standard uses that. However, if we decide that people are not fully competent, then we have to allow them to acquire that competency and then evaluate if they, if you like, evaluate the success of what we've asked them to do. Right, do you not need to be qualified then become competent? Not necessarily. As I say, an increasing number of people are deemed to be competent on the basis of their past employment, on relevant experience. It depends what you mean by qualified, Vitalis. If we're talking about qualified with a piece of paper, with a certificate, with a degree, with a particular piece of what shall I say, a qualification, then maybe not. Qualified in the softer sense of the word, as in qualification of competence, then definitely yes. But no, you can become competent through shadowing, through being mentored, without necessarily being qualified. And I think we're trying to soften the edges and make it that it's not about people having to go out and go on a training course. I apologize if any of you out there watching or listening to this are in training. It's not necessarily about sending somebody on a course, them coming back with a certificate and saying, there we go, we're competent. That has a part to play, but it's not the be all and end all, and the standard reflects that. It is more about competence. Yes, you're right. I guess I have completed a 14,001 lead auditor course. And yes, there are times that in order to be able to deliver this, UCAS do require that I have completed that. Oh, here we go. Lots of questions coming in now. Thank you. Yes, somebody agrees with me. Yes, I have completed a lead auditor course, and that is a necessary requirement. So sometimes competency can include a formal requirement. If you're going to drive a car out on the road, you do have to pass a test. You do have to have a driving license. If you're going to drive a forklift truck around the factory, you do need to have a piece of paper or a qualification. But it's not always the case. It's not always the case. What's the best? Does it? Oh, here we go. Does it have to be an IRCA registered course? Yes. Well, no, mine isn't. I don't think mine is actually. There are various. If you want to talk about training, I'd rather do that outside of here because I'm conscious it's 10 to 3 now. It certainly is in the UK, and we've quite a few slides to go through yet. If you want to talk about training, then we can do after when we've finished through the slides. What we'll probably do is try and get the slides finished round about 10-15 minutes time, and then if people wish to leave, they can leave. If we want to carry on and talk about specific things after 3 o'clock, we can do that. Awareness. We did talk about awareness, and somebody did ask the question, would awareness be a better word than competency? I think they're two separate things. So awareness is it's going to sound obvious. Are you aware of something? It's your knowledge of something. Do you understand something? Understanding something and being competent about something are two different things. So anybody doing work under the organisation's control, and I've underlined include contractors because that's important. A lot of businesses, when I go on their site, I have to undertake a contractor induction where I'm explained a number of things to me. It might be quite often it's health and safety related. It's around personal protective equipment. It's around fire. It's around what to do if there's a spill, if we see any incidents. But that is imparting information to me. So the awareness, if we take that example of spill, yes, personally I would know how to deal with a spill. However, the awareness might say, if you see a spill, give somebody a shout. We have people who are competent to deal with spills. Little bit like the difference between awareness and competence in, say, first aid. I'm not a first aider. I'm not competent to be a first aider. However, I am aware that if I have an incident, if I injure myself, I'm aware of what I need to do to get hold of somebody who is competent. And I think that's the difference between awareness and competency. Awareness is knowing what to do. Competency is having the ability to be able to do it, not just necessarily the awareness of what's required. The standard requires a number of things that people have to be aware of, and they're listed out there. The policy, the commitments that we've made as a business, the significant aspects of their work and the potential impacts of what they're doing, how they can contribute to the effectiveness of the system and the benefits of improved environmental performance, and the implication, the risk of not doing it, the risk of getting it wrong. That applies equally to your own staff and to anybody who's doing work on your behalf. Communication, we have to decide. The standard requires that we think about what we're going to tell people. Who are we going to communicate with, both internally and externally? Internally, we have to make information relevant to the system available to people. We have to enable some sort of feedback mechanism for people to be able to comment on our improvement process. It's not quite as formal as it is in 50,001, which does require a formal process, but the standard 14,001 still does suggest that we need to have some sort of a feedback mechanism where people can come back with improvements both in the standard itself, in the system itself, and also in how we operate. External communication we have to think about. This takes us back to our needs of interested parties. So we're back to clause 4.2, right at the beginning. Who's important to us? Who do we need to pay attention to? Who do we need to listen to? Who do we need to communicate with? What do we need to tell them? The things that we decided at clause 4.2 form the basis for our external communication plans. As a little prompt, I've put together some guidance there on the things that the standard requires you to communicate. So, Will, would that mean this would have to extend out to subcontractors? Absolutely. So the standard itself, obviously contractors coming on your site are able to impact how you operate environmentally. So if you have contractors come on site and they have an incident, if they're using lubricants, if they're using oils and they have a spill and it goes down your drain, they're still on your site. So you need to make sure that contractors coming on site, visitors coming on site, although visitors would have less of an environmental impact, but contractors coming on site to undertake work need to be aware of your systems, your requirements. So in other words, if they are coming on site to repair something and they have a spill, they need to be aware of what you expect them to do. Should they clean it up themselves? Should they rely on your spill prevention, spill cleanup mechanisms? You need to make sure that people are aware. Just in the same way that you would if you're doing health and safety, if somebody was coming on site to go on the roof, if they were going to do some welding, hot works, you would certainly probably give them a permit to operate. not suggesting 14,001 requires a permit, but it requires that you communicate with people coming on your site to carry out work. Thank you. Brilliant. Great. Documented information. So we have to maintain sufficient documented information in a manner to demonstrate that we've got an effective EMS in place. Remember, it's an environmental management system. It's not a quality system. We're not looking for a complex document control system. What we're requiring is documentation required by the standard. You don't have to have an environmental manual. A lot of people do, but you don't have to have a manual. It can be flowcharts, it can be diagrams, it can be procedures, it can be process diagrams, whatever you want. But whatever documentation you've got, it has to be controlled, it has to be available, and it has to be protected. The sad person that I am, and I've done this for most of the standards I work with, I've read through the standard, and anywhere that the standard says undocumented information must be retained is on this slide. So if you can go through your system and tick every one of those lines, then you won't be far away from having a fully compliant document management system and the documents that you need. Now, the standard doesn't use the term documents and records. I've put them in there because it's one area that I disagree a little with the standard. The standard calls everything documented information. I still prefer to think about documents and records. They're not the same. A document generally provides information, where a record, and this is going to sound so obvious, a record records the results of something. So I like to still think about documents and records. However, the standard does talk about documented information. We've only got 3 or 4 minutes formally left. We are probably going to go over on the slides by about 5 minutes. I'll just give you a bit of an advance warning on that. I do apologise, but I think it's in order to get through this, I didn't want to skimp on anything. So clause 8, operational planning and control. We're back to, it's fine, no problem. You will get, as I said, recording, you'll be able to see the slides and everything. And if you want to catch up on the last 5 or 10 minutes, just come back and watch the recording or listen to the recording at some point. Cheers, Sean. So clause 8, operational planning and control. We're back to a doing clause again now. This is a clause where we have to put something into place. So based upon the planning that we did earlier, based upon the things that we were thinking about that we needed to put into place to mitigate these risks, to grab these opportunities, this is now the section that we've got to start doing something. What is it we're going to do? What are we going to change? What are the processes that we're going to amend? What controls are we going to put in place? To meet the requirements that we've set, to implement those planned actions from clauses 6.1 and 6.2, and to make sure that we are addressing our significant aspects, our compliance obligations, meeting our objectives, and also meeting any other risks and opportunities that we've identified, including outsourced processes that we may have control or influence over. I don't want to get into a big debate this afternoon about outsourced processes, but a contractor carrying work outside the business, a supplier is not an outsourced process. An outsourced process is something that would take place on your site. So, for instance, one of the businesses I work with has a forklift truck engineer permanently on site. From their forklift truck supplier, they have an engineer on site 9 till 5, Monday to Friday, doesn't work for them, has his own little area that he works in, services the forklift trucks, repairs them. He is an outsourced process. He still has to be managed. He needs to work to the processes that the business has set up for him. That's an outsourced process. We need to think about this life cycle perspective again. Cheers, Mark. Yeah. So we need to ensure that we take this life cycle perspective into account. We need to make sure that we've got controls in place in design and development to ensure that environmental requirements pertinent to life cycle are addressed. This is looking at how we package things, how we may expect our clients to dispose of things, maybe where we buy things from. What are environmental requirements for procurement? How do we communicate relevant requirements to external providers? External providers might say things to us. It may be that our customers have got 14,001 and place demands on us. This is how we might get customer compliance obligations. We might set compliance obligations on our suppliers. If you're going to supply us a product, it's got to be packaged in this way. We want the packaging to be returnable. We don't want it packed in plastic, whatever. You set those requirements, and you may get requirements set on you as well, all part of operational planning and control. Emergency preparedness and response. Obviously, as I say to everybody, crystal balls are in short supply. We can't always say exactly what's going to happen, but we need to be ready for whatever might happen. We need to be able to respond to emergencies as they happen, with some planned prevention and mitigation. So spill was one of the things we talked about. Oil spills, we're talking about environmental issues that might happen. Yes, we could talk about fire, we could talk about all sorts of different things. How are we going to respond? What are we going to do in mitigation? How are we going to evaluate what's happened, and how what have we learned? What would we do again if this was the case? And the bit that a lot of people forget is periodic testing of the planned response. We're back to that term competence again. Some people would be trained in order to clean up a spill. Other people might be deemed competent because they've been at it for so long. Various, I don't want to reopen the debate, but we might be thinking about what training or competence people need. What information do we provide? And it's an area where we have to maintain documented information. Final two clauses. I think there's about another 5 or 6 slides to go, and that's it. We need to monitor, measure, and evaluate. So we're back to now a facilitating clause. Are the things that we've put in place working as we expected them to? Are they achieving the outcomes that we thought they would? How do we manage? How do we monitor? How do we measure? How do we evaluate our performance? What is it that we need to monitor? How are we going to measure? Do we need to use calibrated or verified equipment? If we're measuring the flow of effluent down a drain, do we need to have calibrated equipment? What criteria are we going to use? What are the indicators we might use? This standard doesn't really require performance indicators. 50,001, the energy standard, requires a performance indicator. It might be kilowatt hours to produce one widget. It might be kilowatt hours per member of staff in terms of office staff, things like that. We don't have to do that, but we can. You can think about that. You can think about that approach if that's useful. How are we going to monitor? How are we going to analyze the results? And again, who and how are we going to tell? This is an interesting clause, evaluation of compliance. The number of times I have been into businesses and asked people about how do you comply, or how do you demonstrate that you are complying with legislation? And they actually show me how they update the legal register. That is not what this clause is about. This clause is not about updating the register. That's back in clause 613. This is about demonstrating that you are doing or not doing what is required, or what is required by legislation, with evidence. So how do we carry it out? It can be done through audits, it can be done through site walks, it can be done through documentation reviews, it can be done through day-to-day monitoring. However, the standard requires that businesses and organizations maintain a knowledge of their compliance status. Records need to be retained, and this is a point from us. I would not raise a non-conformance if I went into a site to do an environmental audit against 14,001 as an assessor. If I found that there was a non-conformance with a piece of legislation that you had already identified yourself and were dealing with it, I would not raise it myself, because it's proving that the management system is working. If I spot it and you don't know about it, yes, you're gonna get a non-conformance. And this evaluation of compliance applies equally to mandatory and voluntary compliance obligations. Internal audit, the standard requires that we verify our conformance to the standard. So what I would do when I come in to look at you externally, you need to do internally to make sure that you are complying with your own requirements and that you are actually managing to improve your impact on the environment. So there needs to be an audit program based on frequency, how often we're going to audit something, and it's all about risk management. It's about making sure that our audit program reflects the risk level. I'm not going to dwell on this slide because it's a fairly quick slide. Management review, we have to carry out a management review. It's a process, not a meeting. The idea being that top management review the system, the top management review our environmental performance to make sure that we're setting out, we're achieving what it was we set out to achieve. So don't forget, it's an odd numbered clause, it's a facilitating clause, it's the ultimate end of, are we doing as well as we could be doing, and could we be doing any better? So it's still facilitating our improvement. If we then decide that we could do better, oops, I do apologise, that slide shouldn't have been in there. If we then decide we can do better, we then need to think about what it is we're going to do. Determine those opportunities for improvement and implement actions to achieve the intended outcomes. So how can we actually improve? The way we improve is to take a graded approach. So our approach has to reflect the magnitude of the issue. So in other words, we don't spend a long time dealing with something that's fairly minor. We take a graded approach. We need to document document what we've found, document the actions taken, and document the results. And that is a very, very quick hour and a bit run through on the standard itself. One of the things that I just wanted to throw in towards the end is 14,001 the end of the road? Is it a destination, or is it the first step in a longer journey? Now, within NQA, obviously, we would like people to think that it's a slightly longer journey, and that there are other standards that you might move on to. Obviously, 50,001, these are two of my standards. There's 50,001 and energy management, and increasingly, PAS 2060, the demonstration of carbon neutrality. Obviously not got time to go into those here. What I do want to bring to your attention, in a couple of weeks' time, we are running, with some partners actually, a webinar on how these three standards, PAS 2060, how 14,001 and 50,001 all work together in unison. So we'll look at what they are. We'll look at how they can work together in a combined system to help businesses meet what's being expected of them environmentally, and also how they can contribute to efficiencies within the business. Now, again, you will see that that's UK time, of course, 2:30 p.m. on Friday, the 22nd of April. There is a link there. When you get the recording or when you get the PDF of the slides, you will be able to see that. I would strongly encourage you to watch that. It will take you further than this, and will start to move you towards maybe using standards as a wider holistic approach to managing environmental impact. Okay, so that's all I was going to say. I apologise for going over 10 minutes, but looks like most people have stuck with me. I'm going to start looking at any of the questions that we haven't attached to now. If you want to disappear, feel free. If you want to start asking questions, I've nothing else to cover this afternoon, or nothing else to do. I don't particularly want to be sat around all afternoon answering questions, but I'm not in a rush to disappear. So if anybody has any questions they want to ask, I'll try and go through some of the ones that I haven't covered now. Thanks, Jack, for your top webinar. Cheers, thank you. It's nice to be appreciated. Thanks for attending. So let me just go back to the top. What's the best method of way to document the scope? That's the first thing. Now, I've come across two issues here. So this was from, apologies if I've pronounced it wrong, Jinica. There are two sort of aspects to scope. There is the scope of registration. So the scope of registration is the wording that you would see on your certificate. So if you're an NQA client, if you've got any of our management standards, there will be a documented scope on the certificate. That's known as the scope of registration. That is not necessarily the full wordy scope that we would expect to see documented. So the scope of registration is a fairly snappy phrase that encompasses what you actually do as a business and does detail what the system actually covers. So if, for instance, you've decided, as some of my clients do, against my advice, to say that the system only covers facilities management, the scope of registration on the certificate will say the facilities management of XYZ's officers at a particular location. That's one aspect to the scope, the scope of registration. Somewhere within the documented management system should be a much wider implementation of the scope. Now, it may be within a manual, it may be done, some people put it within the policy. I quite like that because sometimes what people will do, the opening paragraph to the policy uses the scope as a way of introducing the business. It may say, we are XYZ Engineering, this is the business we're in, we have implemented an environmental management system with the following scope, and you can put it in there. So it sets the scene on the policy. So that's one way, or a couple of ways of actually detailing the scope. What else have we got? We talked a little bit about what's the best course to take as a beginner to be classified as competent for the audit. I've taken over a QHSE and I don't really have any qualifications or a lot of experience in the environmental side of things. If you look at the NQA website, Laura, I don't know whether you're still with us, but if you look at the NQA website, there is a section on training. We run any number of courses, starting with sort of fairly low-level introductory courses right the way through to the 5-day lead assessor courses that somebody else mentioned. And what we would normally suggest is that you look at an introductory course, usually they're just a one-day course that will give you the basics in terms of how to carry out audits. And from there, you might then decide whether you need any further training. But for a lot of people, within your own business, a one-day introductory course might be the way to do it. They are on our website. There is a section, if you search on Google for NQA training, it will take you immediately to that. Jonathan asked, does it have to be an IRCA course? Not really. As I say, there are a number of lead assessor courses. Sometimes they are for environment. They're also certified by IEMA, the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. So there are a number. I'm not IRCA qualified. I'm IEMA qualified, which is considered quite acceptable. Any more questions coming through? Right. What can be most desirable? Monitoring and measurement for EMS. I'm not quite sure of the question there, Prem. It just says, what can be most desirable monitoring and measurement for EMS? I might come back to that if you want to answer the question, ask the question again. How do you define impartiality within the standard regards to carrying out environmental audits and inspections? Good question, Annette. Impartiality. The older standard, if we go back to the 2008, I think it was, version of ISO 9001, had a very, very blunt statement that said auditors must not audit their own work. Full stop. The standards now are a little bit more woolly than that, quite deliberately. I would argue that you can audit your own work impartially. Basically, what the standards are saying is that you have to, however you carry out the audit, you have to carry it out objectively. So just because you're involved in something, I would think you need to take a little bit of a step back, forget about that involvement that you might have, and look at it almost as an outsider peering over the fence. So forget any misconceptions, forget any what you know about it, and actually, a bit like this webinar, go back to basics. Think about what is it that I'm trying to work out here. Forget about any preconceptions that you might have on the area that you're auditing. All it says now, and I've just opened the standard at the relevant page, it just says select auditors and conduct audits to ensure objectivity and impartiality of the audit process. Quite a good way of doing this is to have an audit team. So rather than just one person carrying out the audit, you might have two people. It's something we do quite a lot. We quite often send in an audit team. That's another way of ensuring some degree of impartiality, that you've got two people involved in the process. It's an aim now rather than a formal requirement is impartiality. It's something that you need to be able to demonstrate. But if I found that you, as say a head of a department, were internally auditing your own department, that on its own wouldn't be a non-conformance. I would then want to look at the audit, the effectiveness of the audit you've carried out, and make sure that you are carrying out that audit in a way that demonstrates it's been done partially. Can we use 9001 QMS trained internal auditors for 14,001? Or no? I would always say that once you've been trained to audit a standard, then you should be able to carry out that audit of any other relevant standard. However, in the world of lead auditor courses, once you've been qualified and trained, and I use that term deliberately, to carry out a lead auditor role, let's say you're a lead auditor in quality. If you're going to then become a lead auditor in environment, you don't do the full 5-day course. You would do a conversion course, which brings in the difference between quality and environment. So for instance, if you are a QMS, quality management system auditor, where you might fall down is on the knowledge of environmental issues, environmental aspects, environmental legislation. So I would argue you might need something to fill that little gap, to make sure that we're back to the competency again now, that you are competent to understand the expected outcome of the system that you're auditing. If you don't understand environment, how can you then judge the success of a management system in achieving environmental performance? So I would say, yes, you can. However, I would want to make sure that those QMS auditors had got some knowledge of environmental issues. Right, another one now. For 9001, we audit the organizational processes. Do we do that with 14,001, or do we just break down the system into categories? Right, all of these standards now require what we call process auditing rather than necessarily auditing by clause of the standard. So you're exactly, again, apologies, Chizaram, I think it is. What you need to try and do is try and break 14,001 down into those operational processes. And that's what I was trying to do a little bit when I talked about the odd numbered clauses and the even numbered clauses. It is a process, it's 14,001. It's a process that we can take you through what it is we're trying to achieve, identifying those issues that we have to think about, prioritizing them. Have we got trained? Have we got competent staff? Have we got the mechanisms in place to evaluate how we're doing? You can apply a process approach. When we do our internal, when we do our audits as a third-party certification body, yes, we have to audit against clauses of the standard if we're finding something that's an issue, but we do try and follow that process. So I would certainly not recommend just saying we're going to audit aspects today, or we're going to audit emergency preparedness today. I would try and look at auditing a particular process, maybe a process within the business. If you've got some sort of a process on the shop floor, maybe have a look at that process. How does that process operate? I also run webinars on integrated management systems, and what we would try and do in an integrated audit is look at how a process operates from a quality perspective, from an environmental perspective, and indeed from a health and safety perspective. So we'd look at the all-embracing elements of that process. How's it managed? Is it providing the quality output it should provide? Is it being done safely? Is it being done in an environmentally sustainable manner? So I would try and work with a process approach. At the moment, I've no more questions. I'll do a last. There's still about 130 people sat in. I'll give a last call for questions now. We've gone a bit over by about 20 minutes now. That doesn't matter at all. Thank you, Will. Look, yeah, I would certainly recommend that 22nd of April webinar. The other thing I didn't give out, but it will come out when you get the email. My email address is richard.walsh, that's W-A-L-S-H, richard.walsh@nqa.com. Any of you, feel free to bob us an email at any time if you think of another question. Happy to do so. I'm going to leave it at that unless another question comes in very quickly. Excellent. Everybody really enjoys it. Good. I like to think that I offer value for money. I do get a lot of positive feedback about the webinars that I provide. So thank you. Oh, good to revisit the basics. Hope to catch up again. Cheers, Susan. I will catch up with you sometime. Right. Thank you, everybody. And as I say, give us a call, give us a shout, send us an email if you have any further questions. Other than that, I do suggest that you try and sign up to that one on the 22nd of April. Will be very useful. I will be listening in as well. It's not me delivering it. And thanks again. Excellent. All the best. See you again sometime. Bye-bye.